The city of Brookhaven was like any other, bustling streets, coffee shops filled with morning chatter, and people rushing to work. Life moved on, unaware that within hours, everything would descend into chaos. Dr. Ethan Carter, a virologist at Brookhaven Medical Research Center, stared at his screen in disbelief. Reports of a strange infection had surfaced, first in a remote part of town, then rapidly spreading to the main hospital. Patients displayed violent behavior, their skin turning pale, their eyes darkening, and their hunger insatiable. The emergency ward was filling up, and yet no one understood what was happening. Elsewhere, Sarah Lawson, a local journalist, was covering a simple community event when she noticed a sudden commotion in the streets. A man, covered in blood, was limping aimlessly. Before anyone could react, he lunged at a passerby, tearing into the poor woman's flesh. People screamed, scattering in every direction. Sarah instinctively reached for her camera, but what she was witnessing felt too unreal. Across town, Daniel Wright, an ex-military officer now working as a security consultant, sat in a cafe sipping his morning coffee. The sound of distant sirens caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just another accident. But when he saw a frantic man running down the street, screaming about monsters, Daniel knew something was wrong. His instincts screamed danger. He grabbed his phone and tried calling an old friend in the police force, but there was no answer. Within hours, the chaos escalated. Hospitals overflowed, police struggled to contain the outbreaks, and strange reports flooded social media. Videos showed people attacking and biting others, only for the victims to rise moments later, their movements unnatural, their aggression uncontrollable. The virus wasn't just spreading, it was consuming the city. As night fell, power outages swept through several districts. The streets, once alive with city lights, now stood in eerie silence, broken only by distant screams and gunfire. People barricaded themselves in their homes, desperate for answers, for safety. Ethan locked himself inside his lab, desperately analyzing blood samples, but what he found terrified him. The infection worked at an unprecedented speed, hijacking the human body, shutting down vital functions, and reanimating the dead within minutes. There was no cure. No vaccine. And worse, the virus was airborne, those exposed were already doomed. Sarah, now trapped inside a local news station, reported live updates, urging people to stay indoors. But the broadcasts soon fell silent as the station itself became compromised. She barely escaped with a cameraman, navigating the now ruined city, searching for shelter. Daniel took action, gathering supplies and weapons from his personal stash. His military instincts kicked in. If the city was falling, survival was all that mattered. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to find others who could fight, who could survive. By midnight, Brookhaven was no longer a city. It was a hunting ground for the undead. But this was only the beginning. Brookhaven was unrecognizable. The streets, once full of life, were now littered with abandoned cars, shattered glass, and bodies, some lifeless, others twitching as they reanimated. Fires burned unchecked, and the distant wails of sirens were slowly fading as emergency responders either fell or fled. Dr. Ethan Carter sat in his lab, his hands trembling as he reviewed the data again. The virus wasn't just airborne, it was adapting. His heart pounded as he realized the terrifying truth: even those without direct contact could be infected if they inhaled enough of the contaminated air. A vaccine was out of the question, there wasn't enough time. His phone rang, snapping him from his daze. It was his wife, Rachel. Her voice was filled with panic. "Ethan, they're everywhere. People are killing each other, our neighbor just, oh God, I can't stay here," she cried. Ethan's blood ran cold. "Rachel, listen to me. Lock the doors. Stay inside. I'll find you." But the line cut out, leaving only silence. On the other side of the city, Sarah Lawson and her cameraman, Jake, sped down the highway in their news van, weaving through abandoned vehicles. She had managed to escape the news station just as the undead swarmed the building. She glanced at Jake, whose knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "We have to warn people," she muttered. Someone has to know what's happening. Warn who, Sarah? Jake snapped, his voice shaking. The city's gone. The cops, the hospitals, no one's answering their damn phones. A loud thump on the roof made them both jump. Something had landed on the van. Before Jake could react, a decomposed hand crashed through the windshield, grabbing at him. The van swerved violently. Sarah screamed as the vehicle hit a divider, flipping onto its side. Daniel Wright, the ex-military officer, watched from a rooftop as chaos unfolded below. A mother and child ran across the street, chased by a horde of undead. Gunshots rang out from a police blockade trying to hold the creatures back, but the officers were quickly overwhelmed. He had seen war, but this was something else. Daniel checked his rifle and peered through the scope. The mother tripped. The creatures closed in. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. One of the undead dropped. Then another. But there were too many. The woman screamed as they tore into her, pushing the child aside. Daniel cursed under his breath. He couldn't save everyone. Survival was now the only mission. As he turned to leave, his radio crackled to life. It was an old military frequency. If anyone is receiving this, we have secured a safe zone at the eastern outskirts. Supplies are limited. Survivors are welcome, for now. Daniel's jaw tightened. A safe zone. It was his only shot. As Brookhaven burned behind him, he prepared to move. The city had fallen. Now, it was about who could make it out alive. The streets of Brookhaven were no longer streets, they were hunting grounds. Smoke billowed from burning cars, the stench of death thick in the air. The undead lurked in every shadow, drawn to any sound, any movement. Ethan Carter gripped the steering wheel of his car, his hands slick with sweat. He had abandoned the lab moments before it was overrun, taking only his notes, a laptop, and a small emergency kit. His wife, Rachel, was still out there. Every second counted. He swerved around wreckage and corpses, but as he approached a blocked intersection, he slammed the brakes. A pileup of cars formed an impassable wall. Groans echoed in the distance. He wasn't alone. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, moving carefully. He could climb over the wreckage, but time was against him. He turned to his passenger seat, eyeing a metal wrench. It wasn't much, but it was something. The moans grew louder. He turned to see a lone zombie limping toward him, its jaw hanging open, eyes milky white. Ethan's heart pounded. He had never fought before. But when the creature lunged, instincts took over. He swung the wrench as hard as he could. Bone cracked, and the zombie collapsed, twitching. Ethan barely had time to catch his breath before more figures emerged from the shadows. He was out of time. Sarah Lawson groaned as she regained consciousness. The news van lay on its side, windshield shattered. A sharp pain throbbed in her ribs. She turned her head and saw Jake, his body motionless beside her. "Jake," she whispered, shaking him. A gurgling sound came from his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. His once familiar brown eyes were now clouded, lifeless. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Jake was no longer Jake. His mouth twisted into a snarl as he lunged at her. Sarah screamed, kicking frantically as she scrambled backward. Her foot struck the van's shattered windshield, and instinct took over. She grabbed a jagged piece of glass and, just as Jake pounced, drove it into his neck. Blood sprayed across her face as he thrashed before going still. Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't stop. She climbed out of the wreckage, her breath ragged. The city was gone. There was no one left to save her. Daniel Wright moved swiftly through an abandoned apartment building, keeping to the shadows. He had his rifle, a backpack of supplies, and a destination, the safe zone on the eastern outskirts. The radio message had been brief, but it was enough. Someone out there was still fighting. As he reached a stairwell, a noise made him freeze. Soft shuffling, something moving below. Daniel raised his rifle, peering down the staircase. A man stood in the dim light, his back turned. He wasn't moving like the undead. Daniel hesitated. "You alive?" The man stiffened, turning his head slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "For now." "Name?" "Ryan. Just trying to get out of here." Daniel studied him. The guy looked exhausted but not infected. "Safe zone east of here," Daniel said. "You want to live, stick with me." Ryan nodded, falling into step behind him. As they exited the building, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the streets. It didn't matter where they went. Nowhere was safe. The journey to the eastern outskirts of Brookhaven was a nightmare. Roads were clogged with wreckage, alleys swarmed with the undead, and every building they passed carried the stench of death. Daniel Wright led the way, his rifle raised, scanning every shadow. Ryan followed closely, clutching a metal pipe he had scavenged along the way. Neither spoke. Silence was survival. Finally, they saw it, the safe zone. The remnants of a military barricade stood at the entrance of an old industrial complex. Large metal gates, reinforced with sheets of scrap metal, loomed before them. Towering floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and at least a dozen armed guards patrolled the walls. It looked secure. Too secure. "Something's off," Daniel muttered. Before Ryan could respond, a voice barked through a loudspeaker. "Approach slowly with hands visible." Daniel and Ryan did as instructed. The gates creaked open just enough for them to slip through before slamming shut behind them. Inside, a mix of survivors, families, loners, and former officials, huddled together in makeshift tents and shelters. The air was thick with desperation. A man in military fatigues stepped forward. His sharp gaze studied them like they were threats. "Captain Harris," he introduced himself. "This is our safe zone. If you stay, you follow our rules." Daniel met his gaze. "Rules like what?" "Rations are earned. You work, you eat. You disobey, you're out." Harris crossed his arms. "And there's a curfew. You don't want to be outside when it gets dark." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Before Harris could answer, a scream rang out from deeper within the compound. A young man was being dragged by two guards toward a locked storage unit. He thrashed violently. "Please! I'm not infected. Please," he begged. The crowd looked away. No one spoke up. Daniel clenched his fists. Something was definitely wrong. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter had finally reached his house, only to find the front door wide open. His stomach churned as he stepped inside, gripping his wrench. "Rachel?" His voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. His home was trashed. A bloody handprint smeared the living room wall. A chair was overturned, and the dining table was broken. His heart pounded as he moved cautiously upstairs. The bedroom door was ajar. He pushed it open. Rachel sat on the floor, her back against the bed. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "Ethan." He rushed to her, kneeling. "I'm here. I'm here." But then he noticed something. Her sleeve was torn, her arm wrapped in blood-stained fabric. His breath caught in his throat. Rachel had been bitten. Sarah Lawson, exhausted and still reeling from Jake's death, had also stumbled upon the safe zone. She watched as two guards dragged another body away, someone who had broken the rules. She wasn't sure if she had found safety, or something far worse. One thing was clear. The real danger wasn't just the zombies. It was the people still left alive. Daniel Wright had been in war zones before, but something about the so-called safe zone felt wrong. He sat with Ryan near a makeshift fire pit, watching as survivors quietly ate their rations, canned beans, stale crackers, whatever the guards decided they were worth. The screams from earlier still echoed in his mind. The young man had been dragged away, and no one had seen him since. Ryan leaned in, whispering, "Did you see how scared everyone looked? This place is messed up, man." Daniel nodded. "I don't trust Harris. Something's off." Their conversation was interrupted when Sarah Lawson sat down next to them. Her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. "You just got here," she said. "You notice it yet?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Notice what?" Sarah glanced around before lowering her voice. "People go missing. Every night." Ryan tensed. "Missing?" Sarah nodded. "They say it's for breaking the rules. But I've been here 2 days, and some of those people did nothing wrong. They just vanished." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Then we find out why." Meanwhile, Ethan Carter knelt beside Rachel, his mind racing. The bite on her arm was still fresh. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to stop it, Ethan. I ran, I hid, but it still got me." Ethan swallowed hard. He had spent years studying viruses, and he knew what this meant. Rachel didn't have much time. But he wasn't ready to let her go. "Maybe I can slow it down," he whispered. "I have medicine." "Maybe." Rachel grabbed his hand, shaking her head. "Don't lie to me, Ethan. We both know how this ends." Ethan felt something crack inside him. He had saved so many lives before. Why couldn't he save hers? "Just stay with me," he pleaded. "Please." Rachel gave him a weak smile. "I will, for as long as I can." Outside, the world burned, and time was running out. Back at the safe zone, Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan moved through the dark, slipping past patrols. They followed the path where the young man had been dragged earlier. It led to the locked storage units. Daniel picked the lock in seconds. The door creaked open. What they found inside made their stomachs turn. Rows of cages lined the walls, each containing a prisoner, weak, starving, and terrified. Some had bite marks, but others were uninjured. Ryan covered his mouth. "What the hell is this?" A woman in one of the cages spoke weakly. "They're experimenting on us. Harris and his people. They're trying to control the infection." Sarah's blood ran cold. "And if it doesn't work?" The woman's eyes filled with fear. "They feed the failures to the undead outside." Daniel clenched his fists. The safe zone wasn't a haven. It was a slaughterhouse. They needed to get out. But escaping wouldn't be easy. Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan stood frozen in the dimly lit storage unit, their eyes scanning the caged prisoners. Some were injured, some were barely conscious, and others stared at them with hollow, terrified eyes. "We have to get them out," Sarah whispered, her fists clenched. Daniel's mind raced. The safe zone wasn't safe, it was a death trap. If they were caught, they wouldn't just be locked up. They'd be fed to the undead. Ryan swallowed hard. "Even if we get them out of here, where do we go? The city's crawling with those things." Daniel exhaled sharply. "We don't have a choice. We either escape or we die here." Sarah turned to the woman in the cage who had spoken earlier. "How many guards patrol this area?" "Usually 2 at night, but Harris comes sometimes to check on us." Daniel gritted his teeth. "We move at night, take out the patrol quietly, and get to the gates." Sarah frowned. "And then what?" "Those gates don't exactly swing open." Daniel glanced at Ryan. "How good are you with wires?" Ryan smirked. "I used to steal cars before all this. If that gate runs on an electrical system, I can get it open." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting to be executed. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter sat beside Rachel in their darkened home, listening to her labored breathing. Every passing minute, she grew weaker. "Ethan," she whispered. He looked at her, his heart aching. "I'm here." She gripped his hand. "I don't want to turn into one of them." Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew what she was asking. Tears burned his eyes. He had spent his whole life trying to save people, but now he was faced with the one thing he could never prepare for. "I love you, Ethan," she said softly. "I love you too," he whispered. Rachel closed her eyes. Ethan picked up the gun they had hidden for emergencies. His hands trembled as he placed it against her temple. His finger hovered over the trigger. A scream echoed from outside. Ethan's head snapped up. Through the window, he saw figures moving, survivors running, undead swarming. The safe zone was under attack. Back at the compound, Daniel and the others waited until nightfall. The guards were predictable, moving in a slow, lazy pattern. Daniel struck first, taking one out with a quick knife to the throat. Ryan and Sarah silenced a second before he could call for help. They rushed to the cages, unlocking them as fast as they could. The prisoners, weak but determined, followed in silence. They reached the gate. Ryan knelt beside the control panel, working quickly. Just a few more seconds. A spotlight suddenly flashed on them. "Stop right there." Captain Harris stood on the wall, rifle raised. Behind him, armed guards poured out, their weapons trained on the escaping prisoners. "You really thought you could get out?" Harris sneered. "You just killed everyone here." Daniel growled. "What the hell are you talking about?" A sudden explosion shook the compound. The outer fence collapsed. And then they heard it, the deafening roar of the undead horde. The explosion had attracted them. The city's infected were coming. "Hold the line!" Harris shouted to his men. But it was already too late. The safe zone had just become a battlefield. The ground trembled as the undead surged toward the compound, their guttural growls growing louder. The explosion had torn down a section of the outer wall, and now hundreds, maybe thousands, of zombies were pouring in like a flood. Gunfire erupted from the guards on the walls, but it was useless. There were too many. The safe zone was no longer safe. Daniel didn't waste a second. "Ryan, get that gate open. Now." Ryan's fingers worked frantically, sparks flying as he bypassed the security system. Almost there. Sarah grabbed a fallen guard's rifle and fired at the oncoming undead, giving Ryan cover. The prisoners they had freed scattered, some running, others frozen in fear. Harris, standing on the wall, screamed orders. "Fall back. Hold your positions." But his men were panicking, retreating into the compound as the undead overwhelmed the front lines. Then it happened, one of the soldiers got tackled by a zombie, and in seconds, he was torn apart. His screams echoed through the compound, sending shockwaves of terror through the remaining survivors. Panic turned to chaos. Harris turned his rifle toward Daniel's group. "You caused this," he bellowed. He aimed. A shot rang out. But it wasn't Harris who fired. Sarah had. Harris staggered back, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He stared at her in shock before collapsing to his knees. Daniel grabbed Sarah's arm. "No time. We need to move." Ryan shouted, "The gate's open." Without hesitation, they bolted through the opening. Behind them, the undead were already tearing through the remaining guards, feasting on those who had once held power. The safe zone was lost. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter stood frozen in his home, the gun still clutched in his trembling hands. The explosion had changed everything. Rachel stirred beside him, her breathing shallow. "Ethan," she whispered, barely conscious. He turned to her, his heart breaking. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. A shadow moved outside. Ethan grabbed his wrench and crept toward the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't just zombies. There were survivors, armed men, scavengers. And they were looting, killing anyone in their way. The fall of the safe zone hadn't just unleashed the undead. It had unleashed something even worse. People. Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan sprinted through the streets, dodging zombies and avoiding scavengers. Every turn was a death trap. "We need to find shelter," Ryan gasped. Daniel scanned the streets. There. A small pharmacy stood at the corner of an intersection. The front windows were shattered, but the inside looked empty. It would have to do. They rushed inside, barricading the door with overturned shelves. For now, They were safe. But the city was burning. And nowhere was safe for long. The city was in ruins. Fires raged unchecked, casting eerie shadows against the crumbling buildings. Screams, both human and inhuman, echoed through the night as the undead swarmed what was left of the so-called safe zone. Inside the looted pharmacy, Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan crouched behind overturned shelves, catching their breath. Their clothes were torn, their bodies bruised, but they were still alive. For now. We can't stay here, Sarah panted. They'll find us. Who? Ryan asked. The zombies or the scavengers? Daniel checked his rifle, only a few rounds left. Both. He peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. The streets were crawling with the undead, but worse, groups of armed men moved between the buildings, looting and killing anything in their path. This city is done, Daniel muttered. We need to get out. But where do we go? Sarah asked. There's nothing left. Daniel hesitated. She was right. The so-called safe zone had been a nightmare. What if everywhere else was just as bad? Then Ryan spoke. The military base. Daniel and Sarah turned to him. What base? Daniel asked. I heard rumors before the outbreak got bad, Ryan explained. There was a classified facility north of the city. Some kind of underground bunker. If it's real, it might still be operational. Sarah frowned. And if it's not? Ryan sighed. Then we die like everyone else. It wasn't much of a choice. But it was their only option. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter had made his decision. Rachel was dying. Her fever was spiking, her breathing ragged. He held her hand, tears in his eyes. She opened her eyes weakly. You have to go, Ethan. No, he whispered. You can't stay here, she said, her voice barely audible. Promise me, you'll find a way to fix this. Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent years studying viruses, searching for cures. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe, somewhere out there, a cure existed. He swallowed hard. I promise. Rachel gave him a faint smile. Good. Then, her body tensed. A terrible sound escaped her lips. A low, guttural growl. Ethan's heart shattered. He knew what was happening. Rachel was gone. Tears streaming down his face, he gritted his teeth and did what had to be done. The gunshot echoed through the empty house. Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan moved through the city ruins, avoiding both zombies and scavengers. They had one goal, reaching the North Highway that would take them out of the city. They were close. But the city wasn't done with them yet. A group of scavengers spotted them. Hey! Over here! Gunfire erupted. The three survivors ducked behind an abandoned car, bullets whizzing past. Daniel fired back, taking down one of the attackers. Sarah and Ryan returned fire, but they were outnumbered. Then, the undead heard the gunshots. A tidal wave of zombies flooded the street, drawn by the noise. The scavengers panicked, trying to fight off the growing horde, but it was hopeless. This is our chance. Daniel shouted. They sprinted for the highway, dodging grasping hands and snapping jaws. Ryan stumbled, a zombie lunging at him. Bang! Sarah shot it in the head. Keep moving. They reached the highway just as the city behind them collapsed into complete chaos. Daniel looked back one last time. Brookhaven was gone. The safe zone had fallen. But they had survived. For now. As they disappeared into the night, one thing was certain. The real nightmare had only just begun. The end. Or the beginning.